slow performance on the ASUS Hyper M.2 x16 card. That's what we had in the last video. And I believe Max was the one that identified this. The issue was drive sequencing. What do we mean by that? Well, on the Gigabyte Aorus M.2 card, the sequence is 1, 2, 3, 4 sequentially. But the drive sequencing on the ASUS Hyper M.2 is 1, 3, 4, 2. So what we wanted to do is to figure out how that all worked. So to better understand that, what we've done so we can check and verify, if the sequence is 1, 3, 4, 2, we changed out one drive, which is the second drive, to see how that's going to be recognized. Now, these three drives are all first generation PCI Express 4.0, so they're capable of 5,000 megabytes. This drive, however, which is the Western Digital SN850 Black, that is a second generation drive, so it's a 1 terabyte and it's capable of 7,000 megabytes. So what we're going to find out are three things. One, what's the sequence on these cards as the operating system sees them and as the BIOS sees them? And number two, what are we going to see for a performance? Now, we've checked these four drives because we took it out of RAID because we were trying to figure out where's the issue. Is it the card? Is it the drives? Where is it? Okay, we took it out of RAID while we were in Windows, and I'm telling you about this because to have shown you this, it was just too long. I had recorded it 2 hours. We had to stop because of a storm, and when I came back, I thought, no. We can do better than that. We've got to expedite this. So I got some screens and some information I want to show you. We'll go into the BIOS, take a look at it. But it's suffice to say, I agree with Max. I think it's the sequence of the drives. But I think the real issue we have to look at is how that all plays out. Because based on what we've done in the previous test, all we did was take the four drives, and I was very specific in going 1, 2, 3, 4 when I transferred them. But with the documentation that ASUS provides about the 1, 3, 4, 2, it matters. Okay, one of three things would happen. One, we'd get better performance, not going to happen. Two, we'd get equal performance, not going to happen. Or number three, we'd get less performance. My expectation would be less performance, but the results would be the same. We would still need to destroy the RAID. In other words, delete the RAID and then rebuild the RAID, which means reinstalling Windows. So going down this rabbit hole, there were several steps I had to go back on to answer some other questions that come up with this. So based on my path of discovery and what I want to share with you today, I want to stay with not where I'm at, but where you're at based on the last video. So I want to take you through this as quickly as I can because the end result is we want to get this back up and running and do a test. So the first test we're going to do, we'll do a Windows RAID, and then we'll see what kind of results we get. Then we'll go back, delete that, go back and create a BIOS RAID, come back in and test that. So right now we have 5 drives in the machine, 1 on the motherboard, so we have the operating system, 4 drives on the card, so we can do a Windows RAID. When we're finished with that test, because I wanted to show you right now, I have 1 drive on here and I got some information I want to show you in the BIOS before we do all this. But then when that test is done with the Windows RAID, we'll delete that Windows RAID, go back in, turn the machine off, pull that motherboard drive off, which is connected to the CPU. Then we'll have just 4 drives, which will be on the add-in card. I know these are a lot of times called RAID cards, but they're not RAID cards. We have to remember RAID is a function of the BIOS. RAID on this kind of card is not a function of the card. These are strictly I/O cards. They're add-in cards. They're by qualification. And I think what we're going to need to do is another video about RAID where we talk about the different types and the different levels so we can identify the place where these kind of cards rest, because you can install these cards and the question gets asked all the time, can I do this without RAID? Absolutely, because that's what these are designed for. But if you decide to go to RAID, that's your choice. And because we're getting so many questions about RAID, that's why I'm going through this. But I've discovered some other issues that once we do this, because of this, I'm going to go back and cover those other issues as those questions have come up that we haven't addressed yet, but we will. So first thing, I wanted you to see that we have this drive on here. Next thing I'll do, I'll put the cover on this so we can get it back in the machine. I want to show you the BIOS, how that drive is seen in the BIOS. Then we'll go to the operating system, show you how it's seen there. Then we'll create the RAID, then we'll test it, then go to the next step. So the first thing we got to do, you've seen that, and I got to tell you, these pads are not made to be moved around a lot because if you can tell, they're not in a straight line anymore. I've had to straighten them, and they stretch. I've torn the edge on one already. I can see needing to replace them. These are the stickiest pads I've used from anybody. Good thing or bad thing. And another thing we need to point out while we're at this point, some have commented about the cable on this card. interrupting with the fan, so you want to be sure that that is moved out of the way. Otherwise, if that cable interferes with that fan's not going to spin. So you want to double check that. I've heard that from a couple of subscribers so far, which means a little bit sloppy in manufacturing. So we'll get this put back together. I'm leaving the tape. I don't think we'll be doing any more emissivity tests on there, but I'm leaving it just in case. There's no point in being wasteful with it. Number 1, Phillips. Now in this part, the first thing we're going to do is identify drive sequencing. Okay, we've got the heatsink reinstalled. Now we'll get this back in the machine. And yes, I'm leaving the cable attached because that I don't think is the issue, although we will check it and verify once we get to that point. Oh, got to get our bracket back on. I got to tell you, this M&PC Tech mount is just amazing. Really impressed with it. This will support the card, and we're resting on the video card and the Thunderbolt card. And for those wondering, our test system is the Gigabyte Aorus M.2 Designare motherboard. So we have 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots. And how this all started doing the heat emissivity test, we needed to get the card up so we could do a test and check for heat, for emissivity. But the key to that was not just the bracket, which we're temporarily mounted, and this is our surface we're sitting on, but the key to this was the cable, which turned out to be a look cable. So going forward with PCI Express 5, it's going to become a bigger issue. I'm curious to see when a better cable comes out. Now we're going to be seeing 5 drives on this machine. There we go, post. Now we're going to be looking at a couple of places for information. First, I'm going to go over here to boot. And you'll notice the first drive in here, which is the boot drive, that is on the motherboard. That's a Seagate Firecuda. The other 4 drives, these other 3 drives are on the M.2 card. This last drive, which says boot option number 5, is that odd man out. That odd man out being the Western Digital Black SN850. Now in this option, it shows that as option number 5. If I were to press enter, I could change the boot order. But what I want to do is I'm going to go to another menu, and if you notice down here on the bottom where it says easy mode F2, I'm going to press F2, and what we're going to take a look at, PCI Express, we see our drives, we see our cards. On PCI Express, the first slot is where that card is at that has those drives on it. Then that second slot, which is PCI Express by 8_1, is where the Thunderbolt 3 card is at, Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3. And then of course the third slot is where the video card, and this is an RTX 2080 Ti. The point of it being, we go over here to M.2 and we see 1 drive. That 1 drive, if you'll notice, M.2 identifies the 4 positions on the motherboard. 2 to the CPU and 2 through the chipset. So we're on that first drive that goes straight to the CPU. Okay, we'll go back to F2, back to the regular BIOS. We see our boot order. Another place we could look, but it's not turned on, would be in the menu for the RAID, but RAID is turned off because remember, we're not doing a Windows bootable RAID, which is a BIOS RAID. We're doing just a Windows RAID, which is non-bootable. So we're going to create the RAID that we're going to test on these 4 drives in Windows. That's where we're headed next. So, in fact, while we're at it, I think while we're at it, I want to show you those 4 drives the way they are seen in the operating system, so that then when I remove that 1 drive and put them all 4 back the same so we get apples and apples, we're trying to get some idea of what's going on. So let's go ahead and go to Windows and boot before we remove that drive, and I want you to see how the operating system sees it. Reboot. It's interesting the way the BIOS sees the drives depending on the settings that are applied. Because you can change one thing and you don't see that boot drive. Okay, I hear a post, so I need to go right on into Windows. It also affects a setting whether you're booting from one of the drives on the motherboard versus booting from one of the drives on the card in RAID, how that all occurs. It's interesting at the point it steps off. In other words, when we have a Windows bootable RAID, which is a hybrid BIOS RAID, as soon as we see the boot screen from the motherboard, we see a little donut for Windows and it goes right on. Whereas if we're booting off of one of the drives on the motherboard not in RAID, then what we'll see is a handoff where we go from the screen of the BIOS where it pops up and says this is the motherboard, and then we see the Windows flag, and then we see the donut. So a little bit of distinction. That's going to matter later in another video that I'll tell you about. Some people are not seeing their M.2 drives. There's one setting that if they made that change and don't realize it, could cause that to happen, but I'll show you that in another video. Okay, we're in Windows. First thing I'll do is I'll go to Control Panel so we can go to Device Manager. And let's see how those drives are seen. Disk drives. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and that's drive number 4. Now, according to the sequence of the drives and the letters of the drives, this last drive, which is actually on position number 2, let's do a volume check, populate, and see where that drive is at. That's seen as disk number 2, which is correct. It is the WD Black SN850. I put the label on there so I know what it was. Being disk number 2 is correct. However, if we look at it over here in the tree, it's the last drive in that tree. So one other place we can take a look, and let's go look at disk management. Administrative tools, computer management, disk management. Okay, drive F, that's that drive. And when we go down here, we see disk 0, disk 1, disk 2, and disk 2 is the F drive. My point is I'm trying to verify the drive sequencing, whether it's sequential or not. Now, I know what ASUS says. I think it has, my expectation was something to do with load balancing. In other words, if you have 1 drive, if you have 2 drives or 3 drives on the machine versus 4 drives. But apparently it's relevant also when you set that up in RAID for the drive addressing, how that numbering scheme occurs. So when we went from 1, 2, 3, 4, and I brought those over, I should have brought those over as 1, 3, 4, 2. I didn't do that. So I wanted to take a look at this and figure out how that second connector is seen. And the second connector is seen as the second connector. Most people will never encounter this, but it's taken me quite a while to work through that in my mind so that I could share it with you, because if I didn't understand it, how am I going to explain it? And I still don't fully understand it. I'd like to know more, but I think I would probably need an electrical engineer to explain to me to understand about load balancing, how that works. Now, we could go through that with the drives on all the connectors, but I don't think we need to. Suffice to say, if you're going to have one of these cards, first thing is the requirement is a 16-lane slot, bifurcated. These cards require a high-end desktop or a workstation. Anything less, you're not going to see all the drives. You might see 3 drives. And if you see 4 drives, there's some other hoops you have to jump through. Number 1, it needs to be ASUS. Number 2, ASUS has a list of motherboards. Because we're using the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare, that's why we use the Gigabyte Aorus card first. But now we're testing the ASUS card to compare. So I ran the test with 4 drives individually. The results I got were what I would expect, right around 5,000 megabytes. Okay, we ran this test with Crystal Disk Mark 7. Now this is on the F drive, so it's a 1 terabyte drive. We had it on a 2 gigabyte file test, and the test results were similar, whether it was a 2 gigabyte test file or a 1 gigabyte test file. 7,000 megabytes on the read and about 5,200 megabytes on the write. So on a 2 gigabyte test file versus a 1 gigabyte test file. So as you can see there, the results are pretty close to the same. 7,070 megabytes on the read and 5,240 megabytes on the write. So why is that important? Well, again, we wanted to find out, not just to have the drives on there, but the test. So we tested 4 drives the same, ran this test, which I'll show you the results in a minute. And we ran this test with this 1 drive on that connector to see if there's any issues with the connectors. Not a problem with the card, not a problem with the drives that are on the card. With those kind of results, though, you have to ask the question, first generation PCI Express 4 or second generation PCI Express 4? The significant difference, well, let's take a look at the other drives. Now, if you'll notice, this is drive letter H. So as the drives were identified as disk 1, 2, 3, and 4, it was drive D, drive F, drive G, and drive H. So that drive H was the last drive of those 4, and that drive tested out the fastest. This one at 5,000 megabytes on the read and just under 4,300 megabytes on the write, whereas the other 3 drives tested out closer to 4991, 4990, 4998, but again, pretty close to the same, about 40, just under 4,300. The point of that is, what drives do you want to put on one of these cards? I'm going to put PCI Express 4.0 on a card because I want the speed. Okay, do you want PCI Express version 4.0 generation 1 or generation 2? Because the real equivalent you're going to get is about 1,000 megabytes more in write speed. Is it worth that difference in price? That's something you're going to have to ask yourself. And of course, remember, Your results may vary. Your results may be different than ours. What I've gone through is something probably most people will never experience, where you go from one card to another, but I've uncovered some things that I think some of you might find. This being one of the things that might be an issue, because when we take this to RAID, the expectation for of these second generation drives would be 4 times 7 minus 1, whereas it's going to be more like, well, you see the results. The point of it is you're getting about 1,000 megabytes faster, which when you think in terms of SATA 3, SATA is 600 megabytes burst mode. This is 1,000 megabytes. Yeah, it's faster. But at what point is it worth it? So I would look at the price of the drives, comparing a version 1, which is 5,000 megabytes, and a version 2, which is 7,000 megabytes, and see which one's going to be the better deal for the money, because in actuality, you're going to be getting closer on those writes to 5,000 megabytes and not 7,000. So you get a little bit better performance, but at 1, 2, 3, is it worth 3,000 megabytes, which is 3 drives? Because one drive, it's overhead. So that's just something I want to put out there for you to think about. Now, the next step, what we need to do is to power this machine down, get that 4th drive in there, so all 4 are the same, create a Windows RAID, test that RAID, and compare it, because the expectation is going to be not 10,000 like we got last time, but something closer to 15. Then go in, back to the BIOS, and recreate a Windows BIOS RAID, which will be a bootable RAID, which means we've got to recreate the RAID, we've got to reinstall Windows, bring it back up, then do the test again, and see how close we get, and see which one's faster. Again, we want something closer to 15. Now, I'd like about 17.5 with a first generation drive, but 15 is about all we're going to get. So let's see where we go. And all these numbers, some of this stuff that you've seen that I've quoted, I'll have this up in the description so you can take a look at it and compare the numbers for yourself and see how yours relates. We had another subscriber recently commented that the results we got in the last video with the ASUS Hyper M.2 x16, he had the same results. So that's one of the reasons we're going this, trying to figure out what's the problem, where's the problem at, what's the solution. So what we've tested so far, we know the card's okay and the drives are okay, so we got to go the next step and figure out if there's something with the way it sees the RAID. I don't know. We'll find out. So now we got to change out that one drive that I wanted to show you guys how that tested out. So, folks, I want to thank you for joining us. This is Build or Buy. My name's Gil Boyd. Welcome. So we'll pull the card, pull the drive. Some of you can see now by what we're doing that you understand these are not permanent installations. They can't be to do all the testing we do. You have to be able to swap parts around. Okay, all 4 drives are the same now. We got the number 2 drive back in place so that they're all the same. So we'll go back into Windows now and recreate our RAID. Now this time I don't need to test the drives individually because I've already done that and I know the performance and the numbers. Like I said, to reiterate, we will include that in the description, and your results may vary. But when another subscriber had the same results we did, the question is, what's up with that? Only one way to find out. When you have a problem, you've got to be able to replicate it. You've got to be able to duplicate it, because if you can't duplicate it, how are you going to solve it? So we've had it. One of you have had it, which means there's going to be some other people that are going to have it. So we're trying to figure it out. By default, number 1, the bus should be set for PCI Express 4. That is, because we had it at PCI Express 4 for the other card, and it's by default. The only default we had to change is for a hybrid BIOS RAID, which is a Windows bootable RAID. You've got to be sure and bifurcate that card. I'm going to show you some stuff later on documentation about the cards, looking at the different ones. The facts are accurate at the time they were published, but there's some information that is not absolutely correct. We can take a look at the cards, and then when we get to that point, I'll show you. So for the average user that doesn't understand about bifurcation or what's involved in that, wow. And any of you ask me if your motherboard will support one of these cards, first of all, if it's a high-end desktop that it supports, I'll be happy to take a look, but the first requirement is it needs to be ASUS motherboard. This happens to be a high-end desktop, this happens to be Gigabyte, and it's the TRX40 Designare motherboard. So 2 16-lane slots, 2 8-lane slots, bifurcation's there, we have it. But if we run a lesser chipset, this works from the X299 up. X299, X399, TRX40, and WRX80. Now the last user that had this problem is on a WRX80. He's on an ASUS and he's getting the same results that we got. So I want to know what's up with that. But this platform will be adequate to test to find that out. Trying to keep everything apples and apples. For those that say, well, take that cable out, that's fine and dandy, but the cable worked with the Gigabyte card. Cable should not be a problem with the ASUS card. But we will test both ways and see. Because I know the subscriber that's got the ASUS WX80, surely he's not using a riser cable, but I'll test it both ways. Good point. I can hear Max and I can hear Lee asking these questions, so when you guys get in my head, it's hard for me to, when y'all want to know, I want to know. So what I've learned is never take anything for granted, and you guys have a question, ask, we're here to help. Okay, card's back together. We've got our bracket back on to support the card so that it sits right on top of the Thunderbolt 3 in the first PCI Express by 8 slot, and on top of the EVGA GeForce RTX 2080 Ti, which is sitting in the second 16-lane slot. That too was all done for a reason to test. Back in the saddle, back online. We still have a drive on the motherboard we have to remember. Now we are prepared. Drive's installed, heatsinks on, cable's plugged in, card is in a secure position. Not tied down, but secure where it won't move. We'll turn on and energize. Booting up. We should be able to just go straight to Windows. So once we get there, then I'll change the screens over. Here the post. Windows is the Windows flag and the Windows donut. So we're booting off the drive that's on the motherboard. Want to remember that. Because we're going to take these 4 drives now that are all the same. We don't need to test them individually again. Because I have the numbers. I don't need to show you guys that. But we're going to build a RAID, a Windows RAID, test it. Administrative tools, computer management, disk management, and as you can see we have 4 individual drives, 5 actually, but we're going to take those individual drives, which are new volume, first, second, third, and fourth new volume, and we're going to remove them so that we can then put them together in a RAID. So one by one, step by step, we'll delete the volume. Deleting this volume will erase all data on it. Back up any data you want to keep before deleting. Do you want to continue? I'm going to say yes. Disk 1. And we do this 4 times. And then number 4. Now we're going to take these 4 drives, highlight the first drive, right click, and we'll do a striped volume. And we're going to add, highlight, add, highlight, add, highlight, add. Disk 1, 2, 3, and 4. So next, it's going to assign a drive letter D, next, NTFS, and we're going to call this new RAID volume. We're going to do a quick format or we'd be here for a very long time. Next, finish. So to reiterate, the operation you selected will convert the disks, basic disks, to dynamic disks. If you convert the disks to dynamic, you will not be able to install operating systems from any volume on the disk except the current boot volume. Are you sure you want to continue? Yes. And when it's finished, and it should pop up with the dialog box or with the drive letter, which it just did saying it's empty. I'll zoom out. So we have our C drive, which is still intact, and our new RAID volume, which is those 4 drives on that one card. And it's usable. It's a drive. So the next thing we want to do is we'll close all this down, and you'll notice all those 4 drives are in new RAID volume. We'll close all that down. Let's call up our test, crystal disk. So there's our results. So that's a 8 terabyte drive, 7.4 terabytes, and because of the size of the drive, we used a test file of 8 gigabytes. So just under 8,000 megabytes on the read and just under 12,000 megabytes on the write, 11,976. So we'll do a screen capture on that. You know, the further we go with this, the weirder this gets. It leaves me shaking my head. Performance on this card should be better. I'm disappointed. I'm surprised. So next step now is we need to power the machine down, pull the boot drive off, go into the BIOS, set the RAID. Now because we need to reinstall Windows, another question has come up based on the Windows bootable RAID. How fast is the Windows bootable RAID installation? Well, the issue is not the Windows bootable RAID install. The issue is the Windows Media Creation tool. How fast can we install from that to this? And there's a technology gap. That is going to be also a separate video that came up as a result of this that I can better answer with another test that we're working on. I'm testing more stuff for some of the questions you guys asked that makes my brain kind of, but I hope you guys are enjoying it because I'm getting a kick out of it because I'm learning stuff I wouldn't have known or I wouldn't have understood the details if y'all hadn't asked. You know, some of this stuff you know, but unless you do it, you don't know it. We're finding out together. Okay, system's down, powered off. We've got to pull that motherboard drive off. Now, nothing we have to do on the card. What we have to do is pull the drive off the motherboard. So we'll set that aside. I want to say right now, for any of you that have put an M.2 drive on the motherboard and the motherboard does not recognize it, there is one setting in the BIOS where if you make that one change, the system BIOS will not see the drive according to what you're trying to boot if you're trying to boot from that drive. I'll show you when we get to that point where that's at. Now we need to pull that boot drive off. It's always important to remember whenever you're working on a machine, you only want to have the drives connected that you're going to be working with, or else it's really easy to mess something up that you didn't intend on, and with unintended consequences, might format the wrong drive. And that's a real bummer when that happens. That first drive on that motherboard is the easiest to work with. I wish all the others were that easy. No drives on the motherboard. The only drives that are going to exist in this computer are going to be on this card. We might get a BSOD if we try to install Windows with the Thunderbolt card in there, because Thunderbolt is very finicky about the order of the drivers. So because of that, we need to leave that card out. And because of that, we're going to install without our cable. So we're going to pull our look cable out for now because we don't have the platform to rest that on. So we'll take our bracket off and put it right back on the bus direct. Because when you install Windows, you have to be very specific about the drivers. First, get the operating system up, then the motherboard chipset drivers, then the video drivers, and then the Thunderbolt drivers. Otherwise, BSOD. I don't like those BSODs. So we'll get the card back in. Then after we've done our installation, we can do our tests, and we'll test it both ways, with and without the cable. Video card, which is the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti, which is only 2 slots wide, in the second 16-lane slot, and the first 16-lane slot is the ASUS Hyper M.2 by 16. And we're going to leave our Thunderbolt card over here out of the way so we can avoid a BSOD when we install Windows. So here's what we're going to need to do. We're going to get the power on here. We'll turn this on, and when we energize, we got to go into the BIOS, and what's on the drive as 4 drives in Windows doesn't matter because that all gets erased, because we're going to now go into the BIOS, set up a RAID, go to the next step. Once we get Windows installed, then we'll run the test again and check our results. Because this is all about why are we getting slow performance. We're trying to verify. And the test we ran a while ago, we could run again without the cable, and we probably should have, but it's about running the test with the fastest RAID, which would be about the Windows bootable RAID, hybrid BIOS RAID. So let's see what we get. You know, we didn't get a BSOD, but I wonder now. Now's the time to test it. I'm pulling that card back out, and I'm putting the drive back on the motherboard. I can hear Lee and Max. Well, why didn't you? I can hear you guys asking the questions, so even though you're not here, deja vu, but you're right. Okay, to be thorough, we're going to remove the look cable. And let's see if removing this cable is going to make a difference when we install this card. Let's see what we get. Even though we didn't get a BSOD, we still had a performance degradation. And my concern, my curiosity being, is the cable causing the performance degradation? This is the only way to find out. So step 1, we ran the test with the look cable. Step 2, we're going to run the test without the cable. And again, we'll go back into Windows. We're booting off the motherboard drive, and we'll see if the numbers are any different. Only way to know is to find out. And we're going to, for now, let's get the Thunderbolt card back in. Okay, we've got the Thunderbolt 3 card in the first 8-lane slot. Second 8-lane slot's empty. First 16-lane slot now has the ASUS Hyper M.2 by 16 card, and the second 16-lane slot has our GeForce RTX 2080 Ti. No need to go to the BIOS. We're going to go straight to Windows. As soon as Windows is up, I hear the post, then we'll proceed. So the only difference we've got right now is the look cable. The look cable, we did not get a BSOD, but I'm wondering if this is what's causing our performance degradation. I don't know. We're going to find out. We'll go to Crystal Disk Mark. So we're going to the D drive, 7.4 gig, our 8 terabyte partition, which is a Windows RAID, and we set that for an 8 gigabyte test file. So let's do the test. And the only difference is no riser cable. It's interesting, some of this stuff we encounter that we come across, how there's overlap sometimes. For example, putting this video out, that it's all about the ASUS Hyper M.2 x16 card, but some of the peripheral things that come up, such as the look riser cable, such as, say you've got an M.2 drive on the motherboard that's not being recognized, these things are all interrelated. So I'm trying to keep this brief, but I wanted this to be complete so that we have a, here's the problem, here's the solution. Now right now, those numbers, because I took time to write that down, there is a difference in performance with the cable, which I'm kind of surprised, because we were at 7976 with the Windows RAID on the look cable, and we are at 8287. That's curious. Got to make note of that. So even though we didn't get a BSOD with the look riser cable, we did get a performance degradation. I'm curious if we went back and ran the test again with the Gigabyte Aorus M.2 card, what kind of results we'd achieve. But we are seeing a difference on the ASUS. Now our writes are a little bit off, which is interesting. So I can't say the cable had a big influence on that, because in fact, doing the Windows RAID with the look riser cable, we went from 7,976 megabytes on the read to 8,287 megabytes on this read. Whereas on the write, we went from 11,976 to 12,167. So we do see a little bit of a performance improvement, not as much as I had hoped, but enough to call it significant. We're still not 15. We're a long way from 15, but 11,976 versus 12,167. I'll take it. When this test is finished, while we're in Windows, I will go ahead and delete that RAID so that's all 4 single drives, and then we'll go back into the BIOS. I don't have to, but I want to put those drives back like new, which is another video we've got to do, how to restore a foreign drive. That too will be a separate video. The drives individually test out fine, but collectively we're not getting the speed that I would expect on this card. I find that quite curious. Okay, there's our results. 8,287 on the read versus 7,976, and 12,167 versus 11,976. So we got our test results. Let's go ahead and go back into the control panel to drive management, and we're going to delete that RAID. So all 4 drives are back to being unallocated. Now all we need to do, we'll power down, get the motherboard drive off, and then we'll go into the BIOS when we power back up and create a Windows bootable RAID, which is a hybrid BIOS RAID from the motherboard BIOS. And that boot drive is a Seagate Firecuda PCI Express 4.0 first generation drive. So it's good for 5,000 megabytes. If it were a second generation drive, it'd be good for 7,000 megabytes. We'll get that bagged and tagged. That's a drive we have set up with all of our instruments, which we may change. Now we can get the M.2 card back in the machine, first 16 lane slot, and we'll leave the Thunderbolt card out because we got to do a new installation of Windows. Video card, M.2 card, good to go. Plug in power. Drive when the motherboard is off, and the Thunderbolt 3 card is going to stay out so we can get this thing back up and running. Now for the dog and pony show. We got to go into the BIOS and rebuild the RAID. So into the BIOS we go. Power on. Delete the array. Confirm. Enter. Enabled. And yes. All right. Now at this point is the Windows installation medium. So another question came up that we'll extract and do in a separate video about the Windows installation medium. How fast can we install Windows? Because the question is not about how fast is the Windows RAID installation. The question is how fast is the Windows installation medium. The fastest we've had on a thumb drive is 200 megabytes. We're going to build another solution that we're not going to have in this video that we think we can do it with a Intel Optane drive. We're going to try it, but for this we're going to use the regular old thumb drive that's good to go. And I've done one modification to this thumb drive. I've created a directory on here with the drivers that we're going to need for RAID, because those 3 drivers have to be installed for that controller to be seen before Windows will install. They're on this disk in a separate folder. There's enough space. 32 gigs or less. While I'm at it, don't need the strap, don't need the gloves. I'm going to pull those off for the moment. So we are running Windows 10 20H2, Windows 10 Pro. Okay, Windows is back up and running. RAID Expert is now functional. So I'm going to go to Control Panel, Device Manager. So let's look at the drives. AMD RAID 1 SCSI device. Volume, populate. C drive, 7.6 terabytes. GPT, as it should be. So we verified we got a RAID array. Let's bring up RAID Expert, run as administrator. We have 4 drives, NVMe, PCI Express 4.0 by 4, 2 terabytes each, 8 terabyte drive. 0, 1, 2, and 3, 4 drives. Array 1, RAID 0, 8 terabytes. Array name, none. And if we scroll over, it tells us here and shows us the serial number on each one of the drives. Sabrent Rocket 4, 2 terabyte drives. So this is Crystal Disk Mark 8. Close everything in the background. Took a long time to get to this point. So now we're going to run Crystal Disk Mark and see what kind of results we get with all that we've done. I hope this is going to be better, but we don't know till we run it. So we're Crystal Disk Mark. Okay, we have 1 drive, 1 partition, 7.4 terabytes. Because it's an 8 terabyte partition, we need to have an 8 gigabyte file. So let's run the test and see what we get. It'll run 5 times. Now our goal is we're looking for 15,000. How close can we get? Anything will beat the last results we had. Now that's more like it. 16,000. Okay. Anybody want to identify what the difference is? I find that absolutely fascinating. 16,321. That's a lot more like it. All in the name of science. And the only difference is the cable, the look riser cable. So that gives you some kind of idea. Even though we didn't get a BSOD, boy, what a performance hit we took with that cable. That's a real eye-opener. It cut our performance in half. Again, no BSOD, but geez. That's 16,321, and we had 7,976 using the look riser cable. So for those that want to use one of those riser cables, man, it's been a dog and pony show. One thing is to get a cable that works that does not give a BSOD. Number 2 is to test it for performance. Now we're doing this test with an M.2 card with 4 drives in RAID. Can you imagine what it does to a video card's performance? So until that gets sorted out with better quality cables, I wouldn't use a riser cable on a video card. Now the performance was fine on the individual drives, but collectively all 4 drives, wow. That's more like what I wanted to see. That's better than 5,000. Okay, you remember that's 4 drives, 5, 10, 15, 20. And my goal was about 1750. So we're 16,321 on the read. That's a whole lot better. And that's PCI Express 4.0, first generation. And if these were second generation drives, 7,000 megabytes each, times 4 minus the overhead, which would be a little over 21. So this is good. I like this. I like this so far. Right now we are at 3 hours and 5 minutes. And that doesn't include the 2 hours I spent testing yesterday trying to sort some of this out. So it's just amazing. You know, like I say, change one thing changes everything. I don't know about you, but my brain's fried. And we're at 14,300 and not finished yet, so I'll wait. And we'll compare the numbers. I don't need to go back and test the drives individually. I know what the test is collectively. And now we know what the issue was. But what I find still fascinating is we did not have that problem with the Gigabyte Aorus card, but we did have that problem with the ASUS card, the ASUS Hyper M.2 x16. So, man, change one thing changes everything. So we're at 16,320 megabytes on the read using the look riser cable. We were 7,976 megabytes on the read. And again, using the look riser cable for the Windows RAID, we had 11,976. By removing that, and we're now on a BIOS RAID, we're at 15,000. which is right where it should be. 15,000 versus 11,976. So anybody thinking about RAID, pretty good deal. Remember, when you update the BIOS will go back to defaults. It'll turn the RAID off. It doesn't mean anything's wrong with your RAID. It doesn't mean your RAID is gone. You just have to turn that stuff back on. You have to go back and set bifurcation from auto to 4x4 before before. The documentation for all that stuff says auto. I think Gigabyte says that, but auto won't work. You've got to set it to bifurcation 4x4 before before. The PCI Express bus is set for PCI Express 4.0. So bifurcate the card, have that card plugged directly into the bus, and then you can choose whether you want first generation drives or second generation drives. And in about 4 months, we're going to see DDR5 coming out, which means new chipsets, PCI Express 5, new motherboards, a whole new game. And about 12 months from now, once that happens, we will see Zen 4, and with Zen 4, we should have DDR5. Game changer. So that's our numbers. 16,321 megabytes on the read, 15,044 megabytes on the write. Contrasted that with 7,976 on the read and 11,976 on the write. Well, I'm stoked. So we have restored performance to the drive, and the key was drive sequencing. And of the 3 options that we could have chose, we went all the way by destroying the RAID. In other words, by deleting the RAID and rebuilding the RAID and then reinstalling Windows. That got us down this path. But to get us to that, it took us 3 hours plus the 2 hours from yesterday. So we have Windows up. We've confirmed the ASUS Hyper M.2 x16 works, and the numbers are amazing. But I'm kind of blown away that this one little thing could be such a problem. So I'm eager to see. I want to keep looking for cables, but I think in the future it'll be easier to check and test. But for those that want to take drives from one card to another, drive sequence. To reiterate, it's sequential on the Gigabyte card, but on the ASUS it's not sequential. The sequence is 1, 3, 4, 2. Whew. Most of you will never have to deal with that. So we've got some more stuff we're going to do. I need to see how this works. I got to squish this down so this goes real fast. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. Next video, I'm not real sure. I'm looking at my notes. I've got to because my brain's a little scrambled. We're going to be looking at how to restore a foreign M.2 drive. That's one option, which means I have to destroy a RAID to be able to do that. And I may do that without it because there's 2 ways that can go. So that's one video. We're also looking at how fast can we install Windows, because the question came up about the RAID. There's a technology gap, and as I outlined some of that a while ago, so we've got to figure out if that's going to work. So that's another video. And all this has come about as a result of doing this. And then another video came up where the question was about, and I've read about this, about an M.2 drive disappearing or not being seen on the motherboard. And I think it relates to CSM. So we'll do a separate video about that. And then the next thing we need to talk about, we need to start, and this is another subscriber question, about purpose-built machines. This is going to be about, and we've been talking about rendering for content creation. Rendering, capturing, and streaming. We've got 2 capture cards we're going to take a look at. You can put a capture card on here. I wouldn't use this class of a machine for that. You can use something less. There's some parameters that have to be set for that. Which card's better depends. I want to look at some of that because whether you go the consumer solution or whether you jump to a more professional solution, it depends on the path. If you just want to dabble or if it's something you're going to actually do because it's going to pay the bills. But I want to look at the 2 options that most people look at, and we're going to do a video on that. So while I get this taken care of and figure out what the next one's going to be based on the questions, I want to thank you guys for joining us. This is Builder Bot, and we are on to the next video.